Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation series. My name is Mary Wandia, Programs Director with Co-Impact based in Nairobi. I am extremely delighted to host this conversation on barriers and opportunities, exploring the journeys of women leaders in Africa. Everjoyce and Shamila, you're both leaders in your own right. Could you share with us your understanding of feminist leadership?
So leadership for me as a woman, as a feminist, is about working collectively with others around shared goals, values, vision. And more importantly, it's about challenging and uprooting the systems that have not only generated gender inequalities, but also racial inequalities, and many of the other inequalities that we know exist in many of our societies.
I think the difference between feminist leadership and other leadership is that it has these moments where there is this individual component, like there is leadership in each of us, right? Where as an individual, I do embody the role of a leader, but that it isn't about me, that it's always connected to a collective. But there's also moments where there are the collective elements of leadership.
So why do we still have to talk about women's leadership, women's political participation? And why is it important, for communities to have leadership and women's voices at all levels?
Sometimes it feels like the world, but also our continent, is going to hell in a handbasket. And so that's why we need feminist leaders, right? To give us the hope, to give us the inspiration, to articulate the alternatives to this gloomy picture that we have, whether it's the conflicts, whether it's, the impacts of COVID that we are living under, whether it's, the impacts of the economic models that we have in many of our countries where and globally, where the poor are remaining poorer and the excluded remain on the margins. So we need feminist leaders who have different visions, who have different value systems, and who have a different way of practicing leadership. And I think for me, that's really critical.
So what are the barriers that are keeping women from leadership, especially in Africa?
So you have kind of the visible barriers, right? The written rules, the written laws, the written policies. So those kinds of systems and norms that are written down, that are formal, that are known, tend to keep women out. Then we have, the visible sort of barriers. For example, another visible barrier is violence, right? Or the threat of violence. Then you have the hidden kind of barriers. You have this sense that, you're entering decision-making spaces, which is, if you're talking formal leadership, you're entering these decision-making spaces, but actually, no sooner have you entered there than you discover that actually decisions are not being made in the place that you have been made to sit in, right? So you can sit all you like in parliament and get elected, but if decisions are going to be made in the party headquarters or in the military barracks, so why are you wasting your time? Right? So the hidden barriers of decisions you're trying to influence, the change you're trying to influence, just getting in the way. Then finally you have the invisible barriers, right? Which many of us talk about in terms of norms, values, beliefs, stereotypes, attitudes, both within ourselves as women, but I think more importantly in the larger society that we come from.
So how could we do better in operationalizing this term in terms of, practicing intersectional women's leadership?
So intersectional feminist practice for me is a practice that is able to take into consideration, I think, issues of power. So in the ways that we work with our leadership. I think another piece around intersectional feminist practice, why do we want and why do we need feminist leadership, right? It is because we are looking for hope, inspiration, alternatives, because that keeps us going. Because the moment we lose that hope, that inspiration, and that belief that change is possible, I think we might as well pack our bags up and go home. But the reality is, I think, again, coming back to intersectional feminist practice within and EJ also talked about this within our very social justice institutions. People are exhausted, people are burnt out, there is a lack of care. So care as this political principle, so even in our social justice and our feminist and women's rights organization, you find that, care is not necessarily as prominent or as a lived reality for many people. There's an awareness. I think there's an increasing awareness that we need to do that. And then I think the third piece for me is really around inclusivity, right? So feminist leadership, so intersectionality is, what does inclusivity mean in every given context? And so again, when we understand who is present, what are the different ways people identify, whether it is based on their gender identity, their sexual orientation, abilities, age, nationality, all of those different things. And so for me, again, a barrier to, in terms of our practice, I think we assume that even if we just say, oh, we respect diversity, etc., but we don't pay enough attention about how inclusive are we, whether it is in our language, whether it is in even how we construct and design process, or even in our very actions.
What are one or two critical things that need to happen in order for us to have gender equality in leadership in Africa?
I think one is, we can never have enough of formal training, capacity building. I hate that phrase, but it will do for now. Because I do think sometimes we have expected a lot, from other women when they enter these spaces, and not realizing that they have not formally, gone through what to expect, how to deal with backlash, basic, sort of things. So I think we can never have enough of those. And I think there is still room for those kinds of initiatives. I think the other is in a more informal sense. Again, we need to affirm leaders, right? And recognize them and amplify that kind of leadership. So for example, in the area that I work in, and certainly from my experience working in the humanitarian sector and emergencies, which we see has become the new normal, increasingly because of climate change, recognizing that women who live on the front lines of those forces, of those challenges, are actually exercising leadership and showing a different way of doing things. They are bringing women's voices. They are talking about the resource allocations. They are talking about the response itself in emergencies. And so it's very important for us to affirm, that kind of leadership, where women are at their level, where they're operating, what they're doing in their communities, because it is leadership, and amplify that and find ways of actually supporting women at those kinds of levels, to be able to continue to do what they're doing, but also to connect them.
What do you think is very critical for us to do to advance women's leadership?
I think for me, we need multiple strategies at multiple levels, ultimately. We need to really, I think, nurture those kind of spaces so that at multiple levels, there is this proliferation of leadership in so many multiple forms. And so I think we need to continuously understand what is happening in terms of women's leadership. Things are shifting so fast, and also we need to acknowledge the ways women are leading. The second piece for me is around challenging and pushing back against those institutions, those spaces where, as EJ was talking, all those invisible values, norms, and attitudes play out in reality. And that gives rise to these visible kind of laws or rules, right? So we need to kind of push back and challenge and organize against that in our different ways, in our different configurations. The third one is, EJ talked about this, continue creating opportunities to increase the visibility and voice of particular groups of people that may not be visible in leadership currently. And then the fourth strategy for me is around resources. We need to make the resources available for this. You know, I think one of the reasons why there's a lot of really great success stories across the Africa continent of organizations that have really built successful initiatives to nurture women's leadership, particularly at the local level, right, the council level. But because they don't always have funding, those initiatives are not able to really become sustainable and entrenched.
Do you think there's a role for funders? And what would be your key ask or advice to funders who would like to support more women in leadership?
Yes, there's a role for funders. It requires for us to rethink the dynamics of that relationship. It requires for us to rethink the ways that we put together strategies and solutions to address what it is that we see. And then also the ways that we learn from that. Because I think, it's not just kind of monitoring and evaluation data, which is numbers equals this, this, and this, but it's like, how do we kind of think about the stories of the change that is happening? And what do we see as valid change? Because I think that's part of the challenges often when organizations need to motivate for funding, is that they find that it's difficult for them to motivate because building leadership is a long-term endeavor. Like a really, really long-term endeavor. And I think a lot of funders come into the space and are not necessarily always willing to kind of walk a long journey with organizations.
So my last words to all of us, it's about the collective, it's about the greater common good, it's about other women and other marginalized groups. It's about the visions that we set, which are about challenging the current context, the systems that we live under. That's what leadership is about.
Thank you very much. What a panel. What great insights. Thank you so much, Eva Joyce. Thank you so much, Shamila.